Every time you've boarded a jet, felt it push you back into the seat and climb up above the weather into the smooth, quiet air, you've been flying in the shadow of the de Havilland Comet. It was the first, the aircraft that opened the age of jet travel, built at Hatfield while America was still flying propellers. Britain held a lead of 3 to 5 years over the rest of the world. American airlines were queuing to buy British jets. The royal family flew aboard. For a moment, it looked as though the whole jet age would be a British age, flown on British wings. It had beaten everyone into the sky, and then it threw the lead away. Not to a better plane, not to a richer rival, but to a single mistake, hidden inside the very aircraft that should have been its crowning triumph. What was it, and how did one flaw hand the skies to someone else? Chapter 1. The Boy Who Watched the Sky. The story begins, as so many British aviation stories do, with a man looking up. In the autumn of 1908, in a field at Le Mans, an American named Wilbur Wright climbed into a flimsy contraption of wood and wire and flew it in front of a crowd that had come expecting a hoax. Watching the reports come back across the channel was a young engineer from Buckinghamshire, 26 years old, restless, and quietly certain that everyone around him was missing the point. His name was Geoffrey de Havilland, and he had just decided what he was going to do with his life. He was not an obvious candidate for it. Born in 1882 at High Wycombe, the second of 3 sons of a clergyman, he'd grown up in a house his own biographer would later describe in unsparing terms. An irascible, hopeless father, a tearful, harried mother, the whole place tense with money worries that never eased. He was supposed to go into the church. He had no intention of it. He trained instead at the Crystal Palace School of Engineering, served his time at an engineering works in Rugby, and ended up as a draftsman at Wolseley in Birmingham, designing motorcycles and motorcars and buses. Solid work, sensible work. He found it suffocating. So in 1909 he did something that, on paper, looks close to madness. He went to his maternal grandfather and borrowed £1,000, a fortune, the better part of a decent house, to build a flying machine. He had never flown. Nobody he knew had flown. With his brother-in-law and lifelong friend Frank Hurl, he built the thing by hand, and that December, on the Downs at 7 Barrows in Hampshire, he tried to fly it. It crashed on the first attempt, wrecked it completely. A sensible man would have stopped. De Havilland built a second machine, and in September 1910, it flew. And here is the measure of the man. So confident was he in his own engineering that he took his wife Louis up with him, and their son Geoffrey, who was 8 weeks old, a newborn in an open aeroplane over a Hampshire hillside in 1910. That is who was building Britain's aircraft. The talent was real, and it was recognised fast. Within months, he joined the balloon factory at Farnborough that would become the Royal Aircraft Factory, where he designed the BE-2 and, in 1912, personally flew it to a British altitude record of 10,500 feet. By the time the First World War broke out, he was chief designer at Airco, and his aircraft, they carried his initials, DH, were being built in their thousands. He was a peculiar sort of titan, a naturalist to his bones, a collector and watcher of moths and butterflies, who would one day name his most famous aeroplane the Moth, out of simple affection for the insects. He had no appetite at all for the business side of things. He was, by his own admission, neither chairman nor managing director of the company that bore his name, begrudging every hour stolen from the drawing board by money and paperwork. He flew until he was 70. What he wanted, always, was to be left alone to design the next thing, and the next, and to push it a little higher and a little faster than the last. When Airco collapsed in the slump that followed the war, he simply started again. On the 25th of September 1920, with a loan from his friend George Holt Thomas and around 50 staff, Geoffrey de Havilland founded the de Havilland Aircraft Company at Stag Lane, Edgware. He was 38. The aeroplane he would be remembered for was still nearly 30 years away. Chapter 2. The Jet Gamble. What he built first was a Moth. The DH-60 Moth of 1925 was a small, cheap, beautifully behaved biplane that put private flying within reach of ordinary enthusiasts, and it sold by the thousand, over 7,000 in the end. It made the company solvent and then made it rich. The Tiger Moth that followed became the aeroplane on which a generation of RAF pilots learned to fly. Some 8,000 of them were built. The firm outgrew Stag Lane and moved north of London to a green airfield at Hatfield in Hertfordshire, and Hatfield became, for the next 60 years, what de Havilland meant. The aeroplanes got faster and stranger and better. A sleek red racer called the DH-88 Comet, remember that name, won the Great England to Australia air race in 1934. And then, in the Second World War, came the aircraft that sealed the company's reputation forever, the Mosquito. Built largely of wood at a time when everyone else was building in metal, dismissed by the experts before it flew, the wooden wonder turned out to be one of the fastest and most versatile aircraft of the entire war. De Havilland had a habit of being told something couldn't be done, and then quietly doing it. But the war took its price from him, and it took it personally. He had 3 sons, and 2 of them flew for the company as test pilots. In 1943, his son John was killed when 2 Mosquitoes collided in the air near St Albans. 3 years later, in September 1946, his eldest son Geoffrey, the chief test pilot, the boy who'd been carried aloft as a newborn, took an experimental swept-wing aircraft called the Swallow up over the Thames estuary to probe the edge of the sound barrier, and it broke apart around him. He died of a broken neck. The 2 brothers were buried together in a churchyard near Hatfield. Their mother never recovered and died in 1949. The man who would build Britain's jet airliner had, by then, buried 2 of his sons in his own aircraft. He knew, better than almost anyone alive, exactly what flight could cost. And yet, this is the thing about him. He had already bet the company's future on the most radical idea in aviation. In 1943, with the war still raging, the government convened a committee under Lord Brabazon to decide what airliners Britain should build once peace came. Most of its recommendations were sensible, conventional, propeller-driven machines. But one, the one they called the Type 4, was something else entirely, a jet-powered airliner, at a time when the jet engine had barely left the laboratory, and the received wisdom was that jets drank far too much fuel to ever be practical for carrying passengers. The man who championed it, who stood in that committee room and argued the doubters down, was Geoffrey de Havilland. He had built his own jet engines, he believed, and in 1945 the contract was his. The design fell to Ronald Bishop, the quiet genius who had drawn the Mosquito, working with his structural engineer R.H.T. Harper. They considered the wild options, tailless designs, canards, and settled on something elegant and clean, a graceful swept wing, 4 jet engines buried smoothly inside the wing roots rather than hung beneath them, a slim pressurized tube of a fuselage designed to fly higher and faster than any airliner before it. BOAC pushed them to make it bigger, from 24 seats to 36. In December 1947, they gave it a name, borrowed from that record-breaking racer of 1934. They called it the Comet. On the 27th of July 1949, Geoffrey de Havilland's 67th birthday, the prototype Comet lifted off the runway at Hatfield for the first time. At the controls was John Cunningham, the company's chief test pilot, a celebrated night fighter ace whose wartime kills had been publicly credited, as a cover story to hide the secret of airborne radar, to his fondness for eating carrots. The first flight lasted 31 minutes. It went beautifully. There was just one detail, easy to miss in the triumph of the day. To keep the aircraft light enough for those relatively modest early engines, the fuselage had been built with a remarkably thin metal skin. One of the engineers, John Wilson, would later recall how the nose skin seemed to pant, to flex visibly in and out, under load on the prototype. At the time, it was a curiosity. Only later would anyone understand what it was telling them. Chapter 3. 8 miles high. For now, there was only the future, and it belonged to Britain. The first production Comet flew in January 1951. A year later, on the 2nd of May 1952, a Comet registered G-ALYP. Yoke Peter, the crews called it, rolled out onto the runway at London Airport carrying 36 passengers, 6 crew and 30 bags of mail, and took off for Johannesburg. It was the first scheduled jet passenger service in the history of the world. Captain Michael Magendie pointed the aircraft towards Rome, the first of 5 stops on a journey of nearly 7,000 miles. The chairman of BOAC, Sir Miles Thomas, joined the flight for its final leg. No airline anywhere else on Earth could do what Britain had just done. To understand why this mattered, you have to understand what flying was like before it. The best piston-engined airliners of the day cruised at perhaps 315 miles an hour, low enough to be thrown about by every storm, loud enough that conversation was an effort, the four great engines hammering away through the whole journey. The Comet cruised at close to 500. It flew at 35 to 40,000 feet, above the weather, in the smooth, thin air where there was nothing to buffet it. The run from London to Tokyo, which had taken the better part of 86 hours in a piston airliner, the Comet did in around 36. It did not merely improve on what came before. It made what came before look like the past. And America had nothing. Boeing and Douglas, the giants who would one day rule the skies, were still building propeller aircraft. The DC-6, the DC-7, the Stratocruiser, the lovely Constellation, and would be for years to come. An American magazine looked across the Atlantic and reckoned that Britain now held a lead of 3 to 5 years over the rest of the world in jet airliners. One of its editors said, with what one imagines was a slightly fixed smile, that his only regret was that the United States wouldn't have anything like the Comet for several years. 3 to 5 years. Hold on to that figure. It was the most valuable thing Britain possessed, and it was already running out. The country fell in love. This was, people kept saying, a new Elizabethan age, a young queen, a nation hauling itself up out of the grey exhaustion of the war, and here was proof, gleaming on the runway at Hatfield, that Britain could still build the most advanced machine on the planet. Prince Philip flew home from the Helsinki Olympics aboard a Comet, and on the 30th of June, 1953, the Queen Mother and Princess Margaret took to the air in one on a special flight, hosted by Sir Geoffrey and Lady de Havilland themselves, the first members of the royal family ever to fly by jet. BOAC's chairman declared that the Comet would halve the size of the world. The orders came in from everywhere. Air France and a French airline called UAT bought Comets. A longer version was ordered by Air India, by Japan Airlines, by airlines in Venezuela and Brazil. And then the prize that mattered most of all, American carriers, Pan American, Capital, National, placed orders for the planned long-range Comet 3. Britain was not merely flying ahead of America, Britain was about to sell jets to America. For a moment, in 1952 and into 1953, it looked as though the entire jet age would be a British age, flown on British wings, built at Hatfield. Chapter 4. The Concorde of its day. Step aboard, then, while it lasts. Settle into one of the wide seats. In first class, they faced each other across polished wooden tables, like a railway compartment in the sky. The engines spool up with a smooth rising whine rather than the bone-shaking roar of pistons, and the aircraft gathers itself and climbs, and the thing you notice, the thing every single passenger noticed, the thing they wrote home about, is the stillness. No vibration, no hammering. The cigarette smoke rises in a straight line. A coin set on its edge on the table stays there. De Havilland had a phrase for it in their advertising, and it was perfect. Motionless travel, 8 miles high. One man who knew the aircraft well called it the Concorde of its day, and he was right, because that is exactly what it was. A glimpse of a future so far ahead of the present that stepping into it felt like time travel. Up there at 37,000 feet, in the clean blue, the ride was glass smooth, while the airliners of every other nation pitched and shuddered through the weather below. The cabin was quiet enough to talk in a normal voice. The windows looked out not on cloud, but on the curve of the earth. People who flew the Comet in those years remembered it for the rest of their lives. Not the destination, the flight, the sheer impossible serenity of it. And it worked as a business, which is the part that made the optimism feel not like dreaming, but like arithmetic. In its very first year of service, the Comet fleet flew 104 million miles and carried 28,000 passengers. By the summer of 1953, there were 8 BOAC Comets leaving London every week. 3 for Johannesburg, 2 for Tokyo, 2 for Singapore, 1 for Colombo. The aircraft turned a profit even when fewer than half its seats were filled. The men running BOAC looked at those numbers and saw not a gamble that had paid off, but a certainty. This was the shape of all flying to come, and Britain had got there first. John Cunningham, the test pilot, flew the aircraft in every condition there was, and he said of it, then and for the rest of his long life, that the Comet flew beautifully, smoothly, responsively, the way a de Havilland aircraft was supposed to. He never stopped believing that. Whatever else was about to happen, the men who flew the Comet loved it, and they were not wrong to. As an aeroplane, it was a triumph. Which is precisely what makes the next part so hard to tell. Chapter 5. The Summit. Because the floor was already there. It was there at the inaugural flight to Johannesburg. It was there in the cabin where the Queen Mother sat. It was built into every Comet that left Hatfield, and not one person in the country knew it. To keep the aircraft light, the skin of the fuselage had been made very thin. Into that thin skin, the design cut a great many openings: windows, escape hatches, apertures for the radio aerials. And many of those openings were cut with sharp, near-square corners. The cabin was pressurized to a degree no airliner had ever sustained before, the air inside pushing outward against that thin shell with every flight, harder than anything that had come before, because the Comet flew so much higher than anything before it. And the holes for the rivets that held it all together had, in places, been punched rather than drilled, a faster method that left tiny, ragged imperfections in the metal at the very points where the stress ran highest. Each of these things, on its own, was within the knowledge of the day. Together, they were something the knowledge of the day could not yet see. At those sharp corners, the stress concentrated far beyond what de Havilland's engineers had calculated, and the science that might have warned them, the science of how metal grows tired and cracks under thousands of repeated pressurizations, simply did not yet exist in any mature form. Nobody had built an airliner that flew this high, pressurized this hard, this many times. The Comet was flying into a region of engineering where there were no maps, because it was the first thing ever to go there. De Havilland had tested. Of course, they had tested. They were among the most careful aircraft builders in the world. They believed, with good reason, that they had proved the structure sound. They were wrong, and the reason they were wrong was buried so deep inside their own test procedure that it would take the most exhaustive investigation in British aviation history to find it. But all of that was still to come. In the summer of 1953, standing on the apron at Hatfield, looking at the most advanced aeroplane on Earth with the orders pouring in and the royal family aboard and America trailing years behind, there was no shadow that anyone could see. There was only the lead, that precious 3 to 5 year lead, and the certainty that Britain would hold it. The nose skin had panted on the prototype. The engineers had noticed and moved on. This was the summit, and nobody inside those walls could see the cliff. Chapter 6. The first cracks. The first signs of trouble didn't come from the sky. They came from the runway. In October 1952, a Comet at Rome failed to lift off cleanly, overran the end of the runway, and was wrecked. Nobody died. 2 minor injuries, no more. The cause was the way the aircraft had been rotated for takeoff. Pull the nose up too far, too soon, and the wing stalled and stopped flying. It was a matter of pilot technique. A warning, but a small one. 5 months later, in March 1953, it turned fatal. A Comet being delivered to an Australian operator failed to get airborne at Karachi at night, near its maximum weight, struck an embankment and burned. All 11 aboard were killed, among them de Havilland's own engineers. It was the first fatal crash of a jet airliner anywhere in the world, and the cause, once again, was the same. Over-rotation, the wing stalling on takeoff. Not the structure. The Canadian operator cancelled its order. De Havilland reshaped the leading edge of the wing, added small fences to control the airflow, and the problem went away. A technique problem, found and fixed. These mattered, but they were not the thing that was coming. They are worth setting apart precisely because what came next looked, at first, like more of the same. Another accident with an explanation. On the 2nd of May, 1953, a year to the day since the jet age had begun, a BOAC Comet left Calcutta for Delhi and flew straight into a tremendous tropical thunderstorm. 6 minutes after takeoff, it broke apart in the air and fell to the ground. All 43 aboard were killed. Captain Maurice Haddon, one of the original Comet captains, was at the controls. The inquiry studied it and concluded that the storm had done it. Either the violence of the gusts had overwhelmed the airframe, or the captain, fighting the turbulence through powered controls that gave him no feel for the loads, had pulled too hard and broken the aircraft himself. That verdict was never changed, and it was, on its own terms, reasonable. Storms had always been able to break aeroplanes, but something had happened that had not happened before. For the first time, a comet had come apart in the air. It was buried inside a thunderstorm, so it read as weather rather than as flaw. The cause had a name, and the name was the sky, not the machine. It was the first crack. Nobody could yet read it as one. Chapter 7. Yoke, Peter. The 10th of January 1954 was a clear morning over the Mediterranean. A comet registered G-ALYP, Yoke Peter, the crews called her, climbed away from Rome bound for London, the last leg of a long service home from Singapore. She was not just any comet. She was the Comet, the very aircraft that had carried the world's first jet passengers to Johannesburg less than 2 years before. Captain Alan Gibson, one of BOAC's youngest, was talking on the radio to another British aircraft as he climbed through 26,000 feet. He was in the middle of a sentence. "Did you get my—" And then nothing. Yoke Peter broke apart in the sky and fell into the sea near the island of Elba. All 35 people aboard were killed. 10 of them were children. Among the dead was Chester Wilmot, the Australian war correspondent whose voice millions had heard reporting the liberation of Europe. BOAC grounded the entire Comet fleet that same day, of their own accord, before anyone made them. What happened next is the hardest part of the whole story to tell, because nobody in it was a fool, and nobody in it was a villain. A committee was convened immediately, under BOAC's senior engineering man. It worked through every cause it could imagine. Flutter, a structural failure from a gust, a failure of the controls, fatigue, an explosive decompression, an engine fire. It made around 60 modifications to the aircraft, and when it had finished, the cause it thought most likely was fire in the engines. It did not suspect the body of the aircraft. De Havilland's own engineers kept pointing to a test they had run, in which a section of fuselage had survived 18,000 pressurization cycles without failing, far more than the aircraft would ever see in service. To them, that figure settled the matter. The cabin was sound. The pressure to fly again was immense, and only part of it was money. Though the money was real, the grounded fleet reckoned to be bleeding something like £50,000 a week. The rest of it was pride. The Comet was the proof of the new Elizabethan age, the gleaming evidence that Britain still led the world at something. A nation does not like to ground its own proof. Sir Miles Thomas, BOAC's chairman, forwarded the committee's report and asked permission to resume. The Air Safety Board, chaired by Air Chief Marshal Sir Frederick Bowhill, recommended returning the Comet to service and, in the very same document, admitted that no cause had been found that would account for what happened at Elba. The minister gave his permission. On the 23rd of March 1954, a Comet carried fare-paying passengers into the air again. Sir Miles Thomas went on television to defend the decision. They would not be flying the Comet with passengers, he said, if they were not satisfied that conditions were suitable. They had found no cause. They flew anyway. Chapter 8. The Water Torture. Naples got 16 days. On the 8th of April 1954, a Comet on charter to South African Airways left Rome for Cairo on a service down to Johannesburg. 33 minutes out, climbing towards 35,000 feet, she broke apart and fell into the sea north of Sicily. All 21 aboard were killed. Captain Wilhelm Mostert was in command. 16 days after the fleet had returned to the air. This time there was no argument left to have. The Comet's certificate of airworthiness was revoked. Production at Hatfield stopped. As it stood, the aircraft was finished. Now the Prime Minister stepped in. Winston Churchill ordered that the cause be found whatever it took. The words attributed to him were that the cost of solving the Comet mystery must be reckoned neither in money nor in manpower. He sent the Royal Navy to the floor of the Mediterranean to bring Yoke Peter back up from off Elba, using underwater television cameras of a kind that had scarcely existed before. Piece by piece, they raised the broken aircraft from the seabed. At Farnborough, the Royal Aircraft Establishment, under Sir Arnold Hall, reassembled 2/3 of her on a wooden frame, like a smashed pot glued back together to find where it had first given way. Then they did something that had never been done. They took a sister aircraft, Yoke Uncle, and built a great tank of water around her fuselage. They filled the cabin with water and pressurized it, then released it, then pressurized it again, over and over, day and night. Water, rather than air, so that when she finally burst, the building would not be blown apart. Each cycle stood for one flight, and after the equivalent of around 3,000 flights, the cabin tore open. Here is the thing everyone believes they know about the Comet. They believe it was the windows, that de Havilland made the passenger windows square, that the sharp corners couldn't take the strain, that the aircraft were ripped apart by their own windows. It is the neatest story in the history of British engineering. One bad choice, one shape, a whole industry undone by a draftsman's pencil. It is not quite true. When the investigators traced the fracture on yoke Peter back to where it had begun, the crack had not started at a passenger window at all. It had started at the corner of a small opening in the roof of the cabin, above the cockpit, an aperture cut for a radio direction-finding aerial, at the edge of a bolt hole. A metallurgist, who later studied the wreckage, Professor Paul Withy, put it bluntly. The move to oval windows on the later aircraft had nothing to do with any squareness causing failure. It was done to take rivets out of the structure and make the bonding easier. The square passenger window, the most famous culprit in British aviation, was very largely innocent. What had actually killed the Comet was quieter and sadder. The skin had been made too thin to keep the aircraft light. The sharp-cornered openings of every kind, windows, hatches, that little aerial aperture, concentrated the stress far beyond anything the designers had calculated. The rivet holes had in places been punched rather than drilled, leaving tiny ragged flaws where cracks could begin. And the cabin was pressurized harder and flown higher more times than any aircraft in history. The science to predict what all of that would do together did not yet exist, and the cruelest detail was buried in the test that had reassured them. That section, which had survived 18,000 cycles, had first been tested, once, to a far higher pressure. That single overload had hardened the metal at exactly the points where the stress gathered, and given it an endurance the real aircraft never had. The fleet carrying passengers had never been through it. The test had been, without anyone knowing, a lie the metal told. The court that weighed all of this refused to lay blame. The Comet, it found, had been designed and built and tested to the standards and the knowledge of its time. The knowledge had simply not been enough. There was, one of the reports conceded, still a great deal to learn about the fundamental physics of fatigue. We tell ourselves it was one mistake. One bad choice about a window. It is easier to carry that way, a thing that could have been caught, a blunder with a name and an address. The truth is heavier. The Comet was not destroyed by carelessness. It was destroyed by being first, by flying into a region of the sky and a region of engineering that nobody had ever reached, and paying for the map in lives. Geoffrey de Havilland, who had already buried 2 sons in his own aircraft, was said to have carried the guilt of those crashes for the rest of his. Chapter 9. What America took. For 4 years, the Comet sat grounded and rebuilt. Thicker skin, rounded windows, stronger engines. When the definitive version emerged in 1958, it was, by every account, a thoroughly safe and excellent aeroplane. It was also 4 years too late. Because while Britain had been on the floor of the Mediterranean, recovering its dead and learning why they had died, an American company had been watching. Boeing flew its jet prototype in July 1954, 3 months after Naples. From it came the 707, and Boeing built that aircraft having read, in full, the lessons Britain had paid for in blood, because de Havilland, to its lasting credit, published its findings openly so that no other manufacturer need learn them the same way. The 707 was built with rounded windows and a structure tested with the Comet's ghost standing in the room. On the 4th of October 1958, BOAC sent 2 of the new Comets across the Atlantic, London to New York, the first jet passenger service over the ocean. Britain had beaten Pan American to it by about 3 weeks. The symbolic prize, the first jet across the sea, snatched at the very last moment. 3 weeks later, Pan Am began flying the Boeing 707 on the same route. It was bigger, faster, flew further, cost less to run. Britain had won the date and lost the market in the same month. 76 of the new Comets were built. Of the Boeing 707, 1,010. The lead that had once been worth 3 to 5 years, the lead an American editor had openly envied in 1953, was gone. It never came back. In 1960, de Havilland was absorbed into Hawker Siddeley. The name held on until 1963, and then it vanished from the aircraft, the DH that had marked British machines since the First World War, replaced by other men's initials. Geoffrey de Havilland lived until 1965, long enough to watch the company he had founded lose its name, and the jet age he had personally fought for fly on someone else's wings. It would be tidy to say the Comet alone lost Britain the skies. It would not be honest. There were too many small British firms scrapping over too small a home market against an American industry with a vast one behind it and the deep money of military contracts beneath it. The Comet did not cause that decline. It revealed it. It hastened it. It gave it a face. Hatfield built aircraft until 1993. Today, the airfield where the first Comet lifted off on Geoffrey de Havilland's birthday is a business park, a university campus, and rows of houses. The Great Flight Test Hangar is a leisure centre. A statue of Sir Geoffrey stands on the campus among students who were born long after the last aircraft left. The streets still carry the old names, Comet Way, Dragon Road, and the Comet Hotel still stands beside the road, and most of the people who drive past have no idea what any of it once meant. The only complete Comet One left in the world is a fuselage with no wings. Corrosion has seen to the wings. It is moved carefully between museums now, too fragile ever to be made whole again. The first jet airliner, the one that opened the age, reduced to a hollow shell that can no longer fly even in the imagination. And yet, every airliner you have ever flown in is safer because the Comet failed first. The water tank, the fatigue testing, the fail-safe structures that let a modern aircraft survive a crack instead of coming apart around it. All of it came out of those years at Farnborough, out of Yoke Peter raised piece by piece from the seabed. No airliner since has been torn from the sky by the failure that destroyed her. Britain got the first jet, and the first jet across the ocean, and the hard, costly knowledge that made every flight after it safe. America got the rest. The Comet flew beautifully. The men who flew it said so to the end of their lives, and they were not wrong. It simply flew too far ahead of what anyone yet knew, and the world it opened for someone else.